Hello everyone, my name is Oscar and today we are going to be discussing holism versus reductionism. This is a topic which is in the issues and debates part of my psychology A-level. This video is basically going to be, we're going to talk about some key terms in the argument, then we're going to go through some examples of where it turns up, and then we're going to talk about some implications and evaluations of the entire argument, basically. The reason that I've chosen this as my first video is because I recently studied it, and as I'm finishing it, I thought it'd be nice to sort of put the cherry on top of it, finish it off with this video, and then I can move on, sort of knowing that it's certified and I can come back to this video if I want to revise it. One good thing to talk about in the holism versus reductionism argument is, well, what is holism and what is reductionism? A holism is a theory which says that it only makes sense to study human behavior when you take into account all of the systems in place, rather than the individual parts. Reductionism, on the other hand, is quite the opposite of this. It's the belief that human behavior is best explained by breaking it down into its smaller parts, so simplifying it in a way. Both of these have their individual strengths and weaknesses, and we'll get into that later in the video. Just how you get many different types of Kit Kat, you also get many different types of reductionism. For example, biological reductionism is a form of reductionism which attempts to explain all behavior through simple biological factors. These can include things like genes, hormones, or neurotransmitters, or literal like chunks of your brain. On the flip side, we have environmental reductionism. This attempts to explain all behavior through environmental factors. So this can include things like, well, the environment that you live in, so where you are living and how you were raised, and also certain external stimulus that can come in and affect you. Another key term to know is levels of behavior. Levels of behavior refers to how complex a behavior is considered to be, and how to explain that behavior via a certain level of explanation. So for example, a behavior that involves ritualistic aggression is much simpler than a behavior that would involve raising a child, for example. What level of explanation you use is important because you need to know whether you are putting behavior into certain categories or whether you need to have a specific scale of what you're measuring. This can be very influential when you're choosing a statistical test or when you're making your test in the first place. The basis of holism was formed in the early 1900s when a bunch of German blokes declared that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So this formed the entire basis of holism. Reductionism, however, can be seen in many different studies, including things like Skinner's rats, Pavlov's dogs, and the Little Albert study, which all involve environmental reductionism, as they ignore any biological traits, instead focusing on what is around the rat and how they have learned to react in certain ways. Other places you can see reductionism is most commonly in biological theories. For example, in the biological explanation for schizophrenia, this comes up a lot, because the biological explanation of schizophrenia chooses to explain schizophrenia through things like neural correlates, or the dopamine hypothesis. And these entirely ignore any environmental factors whatsoever, including things like the schizophrenogenic mother, or expressed emotion, for example. As I said earlier, both holism and reductionism have their positives and negatives. So we'll start off with holism. A good thing about holism is that behavior is very complex. Human behavior, at least. Human behavior results from interactions with others. This makes it very complex. So if you're only looking at a certain part of it, sometimes you can miss out on a whole lot of detail. This can reduce the validity of studies and such. However, a place where holism falls is that holistic explanations are very unscientific. They're often vague and speculative, and they cannot figure out which factor is the most important out of all of them. Since you're taking everything into account, it's hard to isolate. As for reductionism, a strength of reductionism is that sometimes it's appropriate to simplify something to fully understand it. This would be very useful when you want to operationalize something for a test, for example. However, reductionism falls because it's very criticized for being oversimplistic. Oftentimes you can lose validity when explaining complex things because, well, you're not looking at the whole story. You're only looking at a piece of the puzzle. So I would find the issues and debates section of my exam in my third psychology exam. An example of a question that you would usually find for this would be explain the holism versus reductionism debate. This is a fairly simple question if you know how to write essays. It would usually involve you sort of talking about what each of them is. You might want to talk about a few different types of reductionism. You've got to make sure though in the description that you would mention levels of behavior because that's quite an important part of it. talking about how complex different behaviors are is a big part of the debate. From there, you might want to name a few examples of where reductionism comes up, and maybe about the thing about holism that I mentioned with a bunch of German blokes just saying it exists. Finally, you might want to end off your essay with different implications and evaluations, both of holism and reductionism, and also sort of talking about what this actually means to the greater scientific community. One thing to note at the end of this video is that I am not a teacher, so I am literally learning this. I'm going to email this to one of my teachers, and so you should see in the comments, which I'll pin or something like that. I'm very new to this. But hopefully I'll get one of my teachers to sort of grade this, and they'll be able to tell you anything that I got wrong, or give some more information which will hopefully make things make a bit more sense. I hope this was useful, and I hope I got everything right. Thank you very much.